The clock struck 11:27 on the freezing evening of December 6th, 1991. The steady drone of the dessert dispensers had faded, and the final patrons had vanished into the darkness. Within a modest dessert storefront along West Anderson Lane in North Austin, an eerie stillness settled, broken only by faint, mundane echoes. A faucet trickling into a basin, a wooden handle knocking against a plastic pail, and the gentle friction of seating being stacked for the evening. Such were the routine noises of a typical Friday closure, as four young women completed their final chores and prepared to head back to their families. Suddenly, an alien noise shattered the tranquility, a succession of crisp, sterile cracks slicing directly through the residual hum of the refrigeration units. Cruising past the commercial plaza, a freshly minted patrolman by the name of Troy Gay noticed the ominous plumes. Initially, it appeared as a mere blemish against the pitch-black winter heavens, rapidly swelling into a dense, suffocating cloud billowing from the rear of the parlor. Drawing his cruiser nearer, the officer caught the echo of those sharp reports. Unaware of their sinister origin in that moment, he simply radioed dispatch to report a blaze. Emergency response teams were immediately deployed. Fire crews breached the entrance moments later, only to find the storefront completely pristine. Furniture rested perfectly atop the booths. The frozen dessert dispensers stood dormant in their usual spots. Order reigned supreme, cloaked in an unsettling silence. It appeared as though the shift had concluded exactly as planned. Yet, beyond the rear threshold lay an entirely different, hellish reality. Roughly 15 minutes from the scene, homicide investigator John Jones occupied a production vehicle alongside a regional broadcast team. The crew was capturing footage for a feature detailing the darker underbelly of Texas. Their equipment was actively recording, preserving the chaotic, static-laced moments. It possessed that distinctively gritty aesthetic characteristic of early 90s technology. Suddenly, his receiver burst with static, broadcasting an address, 2900 West Anderson Lane. A potential murder. The media vehicle immediately pivoted course. Upon breaching the perimeter of the strip mall, the operator documented every unfolding detail. Crimson and sapphire strobes reflected intensely against the slick, damp asphalt, while heavy plumes continued to choke the atmosphere. The expressions of the uniformed responders lingering at the perimeter told a grim story, each man completely ashen, entirely mute, their gazes locked on the abyss. Yet, the lens remained blind to the true horrors concealed within that smog. The seasoned detective exited his transport, marching deliberately toward the entrance. First responders had managed to subdue the inferno, though the atmosphere remained suffocatingly dense. Puddles of runoff flooded the linoleum. Noxious vapors clung to the upper architecture in thick, suspended tiers. Within those walls, reality had been reduced to pure cinders. All hues were obliterated by a monochrome palette of charcoal, accompanied by the cloying stench of caramelized decay, masking a distinctly harsh, coppery undertone, an odor entirely alien to a dessert parlor. That was when he spotted a young figure positioned near the lavatory. She rested upon the tiles, neither supine nor in a fetal posture, but tragically petrified mid-crawl, both limbs extended desperately outward, her entire form angled to escape the deepest recesses of that slaughterhouse. Straining for the exit, for salvation, for any reality beyond those suffocating walls, she ultimately succumbed to the darkness. Her identity was Amy. A mere 13 years of age, she stood as the most innocent soul trapped inside. During her final, agonizing seconds, she valiantly clawed her way toward survival amidst the surrounding inferno. Her desperate journey terminated near the washroom's preparation zone, mere inches from the threshold that promised freedom. That precise spot marked the conclusion of her existence. Forensic indicators revealed she endured brutal confinement and profound savagery prior to her ultimate demise. It became immediately apparent this was entirely devoid of typical theft motives. The theater of carnage within was psychologically unfathomable. The targets found themselves ruthlessly shackled by their personal garments, their cries suppressed by improvised suffocating devices. This constituted a chillingly methodical slaughter that paralyzed seasoned detectives with sheer disbelief. The municipality of Austin had never encountered such depths of unadulterated malice. The sergeant remained rooted in the epicenter of the massacre, precipitation weeping from the rafters while toxic fumes twisted through the shadows. As journalists documented visual evidence destined to eventually haunt judicial tribunals, his consciousness fixated exclusively upon the visages of the slain youth. The horrific interior remains vividly painted across the canvas of my memory. Those visceral details are permanently branded into my psyche. This metropolis has simply never harbored a more profoundly grotesque atrocity. Crime lab technicians eventually deduced that a pair of distinct firearms facilitated the massacre. Such projectile data heavily implied a multiplicity of predators orchestrating the ultimate demise of the victims. Utilizing dual firearms against a singular 13-year-old pointed toward a psychological darkness far eclipsing any botched burglary. It indicated a sadistic threshold akin to a formal death squad operation, rendering any prospective legal prosecution a near insurmountable mountain to climb. The roaring blaze had successfully consumed crucial biological material. Thick layers of grime and carbon obscured virtually every square inch. Rescue crews practically flooded the rear quarters with high-velocity streams, ironically transforming life-saving liquids into the perpetrator's greatest ally. This deluge effectively eradicated the sole physical clues: the phantom abandoned obliterating treads, dermal ridges, and microscopic textiles. The investigator instinctively grasped the twisted nature of the looming investigation. He immediately mobilized every national agency at his disposal. Before dawn broke, detailed ballistic profiles regarding the dual sidearms were transmitted to agencies spanning the entire nation. Subsequently, forensic teams uncovered another chilling anomaly. The primary entrance to the parlor remained secured from within the perimeter. The deadbolt mechanism remained engaged as per standard protocol, yet the rear egress stood entirely unfastened, yawning into the blackness. It served as a direct portal to the shadowed corridor, skirting the plaza. An intruder breached the rear, executed his macabre design, and vanished. Once the horror concluded, the phantom simply retraced his steps through the rear exit, melting away into the shadowed alleyway. No witnesses caught a glimpse of his features, nor did a single security lens capture his fleeting silhouette. Throughout a sprawling metropolis where residents dutifully secured their front porches, seeking a fragile sense of security, the vulnerability of the back streets remained entirely overlooked. The rear entrances remained completely ignored. As dawn broke, the Texas Capitol stirred to discover the most unimaginable atrocity in its history, unfolding barely 3 weeks prior to the holiday season. Meanwhile, the architect of this massacre was already miles down the highway, navigating the pitch-black night with the chilling precision of a seasoned predator. Yet, tragically, merely half of those victims were scheduled to be inside that establishment. The remaining pair possessed absolutely zero reason to cross that threshold. These 4 innocent teenagers found themselves surrounded by neon signs and sweet desserts. They remained blissfully unaware that a profound, creeping evil had already slipped quietly through the service entrance. 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison was navigating her final year of high school, representing the quintessential driven teen whose sights were firmly locked onto a promising, unwritten future. Taking on shifts at the dessert parlor was her way of earning a modest independence. A truly dependable employee, she possessed a quiet maturity and never missed a clock in. Management never needed to repeat instructions for her. As dusk settled on that fateful Friday, she was tasked with locking down the storefront, a mundane routine she had flawlessly executed countless times. At just 15 years of age, her little sibling Sarah had recently begun her freshman year. She represented the classic younger sister, cautiously navigating the complicated maze of early adolescence. Between athletic practices and extracurricular meetings, she filled her schedule to the brim. She was effortlessly embracing every typical milestone expected of a vibrant, wide-eyed 15-year-old, simply relishing her youth, forging deep bonds, and living carefree. Tragically, Jennifer and Sarah constituted the entirety of their devoted parents' lineage. Barbara Harbison's universe fundamentally revolved around the existence of her precious daughters. Every single aspiration she nurtured and every long-term vision she constructed was inextricably linked to their survival. To call them offspring would be a gross understatement. They embodied her absolute reason for breathing. Meanwhile, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas shared a similar innocence. Acting as the designated shift manager that particular evening, she carried the weight of authority. Beneath that professional exterior, Eliza harbored a profound, unwavering compassion for all living creatures. In fact, she was meticulously nurturing a swine, preparing the animal for a competitive agricultural exhibition scheduled to take place a mere handful of months down the line. Her 13-year-old sibling, Sonora, idolized her like an infallible hero. Unsettlingly, she shared the exact same birth year as the most junior victim discovered at the crime scene. That brings us to 13-year-old Amy Ayers, the undeniably innocent anchor of the friend circle. A genuine rural spirit beat within her chest, characterized by a fierce devotion to every furry creature she encountered. Her ultimate ambition was to one day operate her own veterinary practice. To her adoring father, Bob, she was simply and affectionately known as his absolute pride and joy. Decades of untapped potential lay sprawled out before her, a blank canvas of possibilities violently erased. It is a haunting truth that she was never intended to be at that location. The identical cruel twist of fate applied to Sarah. Earlier that evening, the young duo had been casually browsing the corridors of a nearby shopping center, situated a mere 2 streets away from the parlor. Upon deciding to call it a night, the pair strolled over to the dessert business, planning to hitch a convenient ride back home once the elder sister locked up the registers. It was an agonizing sequence of completely mundane decisions that steered them toward their doom. A failed transportation arrangement, paired with the choice to travel by foot rather than seeking an alternate chauffeur, lingering slightly longer among the retail stores, sealed their fate. Had the universe advanced time by a mere 5 minutes, 2 of those teenagers would have safely reached their beds. Sadly, reality grants no such temporal pardons. The official employment roster dictated that solely the older pair were meant to staff the counters during those final operating hours. The nighttime shutdown procedure was a well-rehearsed choreography they had memorized perfectly. Secure the main entrance from the interior, deliberately abandoning the brass key inside the cylinder to prevent misplacement. Hoist the seating atop the dining surfaces. Tally up the daily revenue. Deposit the paper currency into the secure vault. Vigorously sanitize the sticky preparation areas. Draw water for the cleaning pail. Scrub the linoleum. Exit through the glass facade. Once secured, they would slip the key into a paper sleeve and slide it through the threshold gap. The repetitive tasks were so deeply ingrained that muscle memory alone could carry them through. Yet, this specific shift contained a tragic deviation. A quartet of youths occupied the space instead of a duo. There is absolutely no way the monster anticipating them could have foreseen this variable. He might have been stalking the premises from the shadows. He likely calculated that precisely 2 workers would remain isolated once the open sign went dark. However, the sudden arrival of 2 young siblings seeking transit home was an uncontrollable anomaly that shattered any premeditated blueprint. It boiled down to pure coincidence, manifesting in its most brutal and unforgiving form. The interrupted tidying process provided detectives with a precise chronological freeze frame of the ambush. The furniture was inverted, yet the basins remained drawn, and the washing pail sat partially loaded. They were actively executing their sanitation duties when the nightmare commenced. Those chores would remain permanently incomplete. The phantom assailant either breached the unbolted service entrance while they were distracted, or he had been lurking all along. Perhaps he entered as a patron, occupying a corner booth to observe the final diners depart. And as the deadbolt clicked shut and the unsuspecting teenagers pivoted toward their duties, a silent predator remained comfortably stationed in the peripheral shadows. He was methodically tracking the minute hand, exercising a chilling composure, fully aware of the horrific violence he was preparing to unleash. Regardless of his entry method, by the moment pure terror dawned on them, the primary exit was sealed, leaving their executioner squarely obstructing the sole avenue of escape. Catastrophic news invaded these households at midnight. Shrill telephone rings instantly obliterated their reality. A devastated mother was stripped of her entire progeny. A double, unimaginable blow. Her girls, the singular lights of her life, were simultaneously extinguished within the very same confined space under the cover of darkness. Years afterward, she uttered a sentiment that continues to haunt the historical record over 3 decades later, reflecting on how her core existence was inextricably tethered to their well-being. A stranger permanently robbed her of forever. Allow the gravity of that profound, devastating realization to linger in your mind. A faceless entity literally stole her infinity. In a parallel nightmare, a grieving father was robbed of his youngest child, the aspiring animal doctor, whose heart bled for every stray she encountered. He was violently denied the privilege of cheering at her commencement, forbidden from witnessing her acceptance into medical studies, and permanently robbed of observing her blossom into womanhood. Ultimately, he was left clutching nothing but ghostly fragments of her past and shattered illusions of her brilliant future. His final, aching desire was simply to watch her cross a stage she would never reach. Her father had envisioned a future where she healed animals. She was undeniably tethered to him. Then came Sonora Thomas, her sibling, barely hitting 13 years of age. Upon discovering that her older sibling had vanished permanently, her juvenile psyche entirely rejected the grim reality. Through the ensuing days, the teenager clung to a desperate delusion, convincing herself her sibling had miraculously fled into hiding. She maintained a haunting hope that at any given moment, the front entrance would swing open, revealing a perfectly breathing, unscathed girl returning to their sanctuary. She recalled clinging tightly to those agonizing illusions over the ensuing days, imagining her sibling breaking free and returning safely, a fragile psychological tether to sanity. That return never materialized. Consequently, a vital fragment of the familial spirit shattered beyond any hope of restoration. Spoken memories of her vanished entirely, replaced by permanent erasure. Her identity was systematically scrubbed from shared meals, quiet transit moments, and the evening hush. An absolute void of conversation became their sole coping mechanism. Following the tragedy, the household maintained a suffocating embargo on her very existence. Uttering a single syllable bred unbearable agony. The phantom in the darkness extinguished much more than the lives of those 4 young victims. The perpetrator stole the very voices of the grieving relatives. Yet, as households withered in mute devastation, the surrounding metropolis erupted in a desperate outcry for justice. Massive signs loomed over the interstates. Flickering memorials illuminated the intersections, alongside a $25,000 bounty that eventually swelled to $100,000. Telephone boards lit up relentlessly. Authorities ultimately compiled a staggering roster of 342 potential perpetrators. The initial tangible breakthrough surfaced merely 8 sunrises following the massacre, situated inside the North Cross shopping center. This was the exact commercial hub the other victims visited hours prior to their fatal one-way journey toward that cursed dessert parlor. Guards intercepted a 16-year-old carrying a fully loaded .22 caliber handgun, concealed in his clothing, an exact structural match to the murder weapon. Identified as Maurice Pierce, the armed adolescent endured relentless interrogation. Once horrifying crime scene visuals were shoved toward his youthful gaze, he finally cracked. The adolescent confessed to steering the escape vehicle that evening. Furthermore, he pointed fingers at a trio of associates. Among them was Forrest Wellborn, perceived as the silent companion. Next was Michael Scott, the compliant shadow, and Robert Springsteen, supposedly the primary executioner. Suddenly, investigators possessed identities, physical profiles, and a concrete path forward. However, this fabricated narrative disintegrated practically overnight. Law enforcement concealed a recording device on their informant, dispatching him to engage his alleged accomplice, while agents monitored the audio from an unmarked vehicle. Probing for a confession, the informant bluntly questioned the authenticity of the murder claims. The accused associate immediately brushed it off as a morbid jest. Then came a revelation that shattered the entire theory. The boy expressed genuine confusion, reminding his friend they were together the entire evening, completely oblivious to the accusations. Subsequent interrogations of the remaining 2 suspects yielded nothing but vehement, unwavering denials of any involvement. Without substantial proof, authorities had no choice but to cut the quartet loose. Still, those identities lingered in the files. As the hunt grew increasingly frantic, the investigation spiraled dangerously far from factual reality. 60 days later, tactical units breached the residence of a female fringe cult affiliate following whispers that her circle possessed intimate knowledge of the massacre. Inside the perimeter, squads unearthed nothing but rodent remains and dramatic costumes mere theatrical escapism. It was a spectacular dead end. This misstep signaled a collapsing inquiry. Suddenly, a promising international connection emerged south of the border, convincing the nation that closure had finally arrived. Forensics had generated a facial rendering based on bystander accounts of a suspicious individual idling in a vehicle near the crime scene. Investigators specializing in sexual offenses froze the moment they laid eyes on that particular drawing. It was an uncanny duplicate of their own suspect. Barely 21 days prior to the massacre, another local female victim had endured abduction and brutalization. From that separate incident, 3 suspect portraits circulated. One visage mirrored the current phantom with chilling accuracy. Intelligence reports tracked the fugitives across the southern border, leading to the swift capture and detainment of a pair. Shortly thereafter, foreign officials delivered a shockwave broadcast that paralyzed American media outlets. The detained suspects had formally admitted to the horrific killings. International authorities vowed to prosecute the pair. Front pages exploded with the revelation, allowing the devastated relatives a fleeting, dangerous flicker of hope. Yet, this supposed resolution was nothing but a bureaucratic illusion. The transcribed admissions sounded convincing, but completely contradicted the gruesome physical reality of the crime scene. Ballistic details provided by the men were entirely inaccurate. Even their description of the building interior failed to align. Upon traveling south to conduct fresh interrogations, the lead detective watched the suspects recant immediately, suggesting the initial admissions were brutally coerced. Once again, the grieving relatives were handed salvation, only to have it violently snatched back. This psychological torture became a recurring nightmare. Throughout the following 36 months, a half-dozen separate individuals claimed responsibility for the atrocity. 6 fully documented, formalized admissions of guilt. Half a dozen suspects occupied questioning chambers, casually taking credit for the most vicious slaughter the community had ever witnessed. Yet, each was spinning a web of pure fiction. Every single statement crumbled under scrutiny. None corroborated the forensic data, rendering the very concept of an admission utterly worthless in this investigation. That specific detail would carry terrifying weight when the narrative resurfaced decades down the line. Meanwhile, the lead investigator was spiritually deteriorating. By 1994, enduring 36 agonizing months at the helm, he was abruptly reassigned from the murder squad. The haunting oath he swore to the victims' relatives on that blood-soaked evening remained unfulfilled. On that evening, he donned a distinctive green and white button-down, stating its next appearance would serve as a dark confirmation that the killer was finally identified. 36 months passed, yet that garment remained entirely untouched. Shoved into the depths of a dark wardrobe, it stayed hidden. A new investigative team assumed control, yet their fresh perspectives yielded the same suffocating dead ends. Months bled into endless years. Tip lines fell eerily silent, while the weathered public appeal signs were systematically dismantled. The horrific frozen treat shop massacre gradually vanished from local headlines, though it remained an ever-present nightmare for grieving relatives. In our deep dives, no tragedy is merely a narrative. Each exploration represents countless hours excavating sealed documents and authenticating historical fragments, all dedicated to memorializing those brutally taken. We dedicate practically 15 days of intensive scrutiny to every episode, guaranteeing these grim realities are forever cemented in collective memory. Should you feel these profound tragedies demand a voice, consider leaving an endorsement, joining our following, and voicing your theories below. Your engagement fuels this relentless pursuit of clarity. Additional resolved mysteries await exploration within the provided references below. Let us now plunge back into the chilling depths of this inquiry. In 1996, Amy's grieving matriarch, Pam, addressed the press. Half a decade evaporated, yielding 0 detentions, 0 suspects, and 0 closure. The perpetrators are likely wandering free, indulging in an ordinary existence. Meanwhile, our reality has been permanently fractured, never returning to what it once was. During that identical calendar year, Maria Eliza's devastated mother gathered her belongings and permanently fled Austin. The psychological toll of encountering inquisitive locals probing into the tragedy, combined with inescapable geographic triggers, became far too agonizing to endure. She abandoned the exact municipality where her child was stolen, realizing remaining functioned as daily psychological torture. For another half-decade, the investigation remained entirely paralyzed. The dossier collected dust inside a metal drawer, while the shadowy figure who slaughtered those teens continued breathing free air somewhere across the globe. Suddenly, in October 1999, an entirely different investigative unit resurrected the dormant files. They hypothesized their predecessors identified the true culprits initially, possessing a calculated strategy to validate it. They possessed absolutely 0 fresh biological proof, not a single latent smudge, nor a stray microscopic thread. Their entire arsenal consisted of an abstract hypothesis and a living weapon deployed to enforce it. Detective Hector Polanco, an undisputed extraction specialist, he was an interrogator, reputed to secure an admission at any cost. Yet, a sinister darkness loomed over his immaculate success rate. Back in 1988, he relentlessly grilled a pair of individuals identified as Christopher Ochoa and Richard Danziger. Each provided a sworn admission. Each faced a brutal guilty verdict. Each was condemned to life imprisonment. Decades down the line, both were completely cleared of all wrongdoing. Polanco had psychologically shattered two blameless citizens, condemning them to maximum security for atrocities they had zero part in. A fellow officer would eventually utter a statement serving as a glaring red flag. I personally witnessed him extracting guilt from suspects entirely disconnected from the offense. This was the psychological operative they unleashed inside a closed room alongside Michael Scott. By then, Scott was 24, legally wed, and residing peacefully within Austin. An investigator had previously reached out to him months prior. During that exchange, Scott vehemently maintained his absolute innocence. He claimed total ignorance regarding the savage killings. Yet this fresh task force refused his denial. They escalated the situation, funneling in additional personnel before deploying their ultimate weapon, Polanco. Relentlessly cycling through shifts, day upon grueling day, totaling 4 days of intense questioning, Scott endured what he later characterized as an inescapable psychological meat grinder until his mental fortitude collapsed. He surrendered a handwritten confession spanning 8 agonizing pages, coupled with 18 continuous hours of documented audio interrogations. His narrative detailed approaching the frozen dessert parlor intending to plunder it. He placed Maurice wielding a .22 caliber, Robert clutching a .380, and stationed Forrest outdoors keeping watch. Slipping inside, through a negligently unlatched rear entrance, their seemingly straightforward heist mutated into a catastrophic nightmare. The young women were brutally bound, tears flowed, firearms unexpectedly discharged. Then, igniting a deliberate inferno to mask the horrors, the intruders vanished into the night. Seeking refuge beneath a concrete overpass, Scott recalled violently vomiting from shock. Later that exact same weekend, the crew hijacked a Pathfinder and hastily fled toward San Antonio. Certain specifics felt completely inaccessible to an uninvolved bystander. Scott accurately recounted that the main entryway had been deadbolted from within the establishment. He explicitly referenced the specialized deposit lockbox. He claimed the victims were deliberately piled upon one another, specifying the blaze was ignited directly atop their lifeless remains. Such gruesome intricacies had strictly been withheld from public consumption. This left investigators staring down 2 chilling potential realities. Either Scott stood amidst the carnage and possessed first-hand knowledge, or his interrogators slowly spoon-fed him the narrative, fragment by fragment, throughout those grueling 4 days. However, the magnetic recordings paint a vastly different psychological portrait. His recollection was a constantly morphing mirage. He provided contradictory geographical layouts of the store's interior, alongside wildly fluctuating depictions regarding the exact manner the victims suffered. During a pivotal moment, an investigator strategically planted a crucial detail, inquiring whether a specific victim suffered dual gunshot wounds rather than a single strike. Scott blindly concurred, lacking independent insight. That vital puzzle piece was literally handed to his exhausted mind. Moments later, it miraculously cemented itself into his official admission of guilt. Authorities escorted him on a vehicular sweep, desperately attempting to locate his fabled concrete overpass. The search proved entirely fruitless, yet interrogators escalated tactics far beyond mere verbal coercion. They initiated a psychological invasion. Both Scott, and eventually Springsteen, were convinced traumatic recollections become buried, and through specific mental exertion, those suppressed visions might be forcefully extracted. Consequently, each suspect was subjected to a formal state of clinical hypnosis. Dr. Robert Schomer, a forensic psychology expert, subsequently testified that persuading an accused individual their buried thoughts could be retrieved crossed beyond profound professional misconduct. It was an inherently catastrophic manipulation. Such profound mental conditioning possesses the terrifying capability of convincing a completely innocent civilian they actually executed atrocities they never witnessed. The interrogators had long abandoned standard inquisitions. They were actively invading their subjects' subconscious realms, effectively reprogramming the very fabric of their own reality. Ultimately, the lines between stark reality and the fabricated police narrative had completely blurred in Michael Scott's mind. Reflecting on the ordeal, he struggled to articulate the mental breakdown. The sheer psychological manipulation remains a terrifying enigma. Pause and absorb the chilling gravity of this. For a fleeting period, he genuinely believed he harbored guilt in the massacre. Confined for 4 grueling days with interrogators who weaponized deceit and claimed his memories were repressed, a blameless individual emerged, genuinely convinced he harbored a killer's instincts. Up in West Virginia, authorities subjected Springsteen to an unrelenting 5-hour inquisition. Throughout the grueling session, he maintained absolute innocence, swearing he was nowhere near the carnage. Yet, the investigators relentlessly turned the screws. Detectives bluffed about a ballistic match to a .22 caliber weapon, a pure fabrication. They then falsely claimed his supposed accomplice had sung like a canary. Investigators subtly seeded classified crime scene facts, waiting for the suspect to mirror them. Following 5 agonizing hours of coercion, his psychological defenses finally shattered. Crushed by the excruciating weight of the interrogation room, he yielded a formal confession. He implicated himself in the bloodshed, reciting precise, unreleased particulars knowledge held exclusively by the true perpetrators, or systematically implanted by authorities. He recalled the exact agonizing posture one victim was discovered in. But was this chilling visual drawn from first-hand trauma, because he had physically loomed above her, or had interrogators unknowingly spoon-fed him the imagery during those 5 hours until it morphed into a false memory? Defense counsel Joe James Sawyer harbored zero illusions about what truly transpired. The detectives essentially tortured his client into submission. Years later, the accused recounted being psychologically battered until his tormentors extracted their desired narrative. He realized walking out was an impossibility. They methodically dismantled his sanity. Upon learning of the apprehension, Jones instinctually recalled the distinct green and white garment. Yet, the revelation that the admissions were entirely coerced halted him. Bereft of biological ties, a murder instrument, or any physical proof, he simply shut away the theory. Authorities dragged Forrest Wellborn in front of twin grand juries. On both occasions, the panel scrutinized the state's hollow case and outright rejected the indictment. The evidence was a ghost. Officially cleared, the suspect found that his legal victory offered zero salvation. His identity was permanently branded across broadcast networks, forever shackled to the most horrific slaughter Austin had ever witnessed. Broadcasted weeping in shackles, his reputation was decimated. The resulting stigma eradicated his livelihood, thoroughly annihilating the existence he once knew. Despite 2 separate panels confirming his innocence, the merciless court of public opinion had already passed its sentence. From the tender age of 16, the suffocating grip of law enforcement broke Maurice Pierce. The relentless harassment birthed a volatile cocktail of severe paranoia and blinding hatred toward the badge. Companions observed that the psychological scars inflicted in those initial questioning rooms utterly defined his adult identity. A standard highway pullover eventually culminated in tragedy when a panicked Maurice plunged a blade into a cop, prompting lethal return fire. Bleeding out on the asphalt, his demise drew zero sympathy from certain grieving relatives, while one victim's father lamented being robbed of a courtroom conviction. Yet, the underlying reality was far more profoundly tragic. He was never the remorseless monster the authorities had painted him as. This narrowed the crosshairs onto Scott and Springsteen. Come 2001, a full decade following the massacre, courtroom proceedings finally commenced. Facing independent tribunals and the threat of lethal injection, the state's entire strategy dangled precariously on those contested interrogations. Lacking any bloody fingerprints, a murder weapon, or microscopic traces, the prosecution relied solely on broken syllables, extracted through psychological warfare. The state attorneys quietly recognized the fragility of their coercion-built case. Consequently, they orchestrated a seemingly brilliant legal maneuver, one destined to eventually implode their entire prosecution. Exploiting the bifurcated trials, the state cross-pollinated the testimonies, injecting fragments of each suspect's admission into his counterpart's hearing. Jurors judging the first defendant were spoon-fed the second's supposed narrative, while the alternate panel received the exact inverse treatment. The manufactured admissions mirrored one another perfectly. 2 isolated suspects reciting an identical, horrifying sequence of events. For the captive audience in the jury box, it resonated as absolute certainty. Yet, crucially, neither accused ever testified against their supposed accomplice. This effectively neutralized any opportunity for cross-examination. Defense teams were completely barred from interrogating the invisible witness whose words were damning their clients. In a mirrored injustice, the opposing counsel was equally handcuffed, unable to probe the other suspect's alleged narrative. Defense counsel Joe James Sawyer labeled the tactic a calculated, systemic abuse of constitutional rights. The courtroom drama dragged on for 3 weeks. Following 13 grueling hours behind closed doors, the jury delivered a devastating final blow: a conviction for capital murder. Condemned to death row, a suspect wholly exonerated by subsequent biological testing found himself rotting in a cage, awaiting execution for a massacre he never witnessed. 12 months later, the justice system claimed its next casualty. The second defendant secured a life sentence behind bars. For the traumatized relatives, the verdicts offered the first semblance of oxygen they had tasted in 10 agonizing years. Driven by a decade of profound sorrow, one devastated mother addressed the media with chilling, absolute conviction. She declared them the indisputable butchers. Yet, in a razor-thin 5-4 appellate ruling, the highest Texas court completely obliterated both convictions. A core constitutional safeguard protecting individuals from faceless accusers had been fundamentally breached. Neither accused youth ever confronted the other beneath the harsh courtroom lights. Damaging statements were weaponized in isolated trials, leaving both utterly defenseless. Upon hearing this legal reversal, something broke deeply within the victim's grieving mother. Hearing endless debates regarding compromised suspect privileges pushed her dangerously close to a total psychological breakdown. The brutal slaughter of innocent children completely shattered any lingering illusions regarding cosmic justice or basic societal fairness. Yet, the legal unraveling continued. Incoming prosecutor Rosemary Lemberg assumed control, determined to drag the defendants back before a judge. Desperate to solidify her prosecution, investigators demanded modern biological analysis on physical material retrieved from the slain teenagers in 1991. They utilized advanced y-str forensics, a highly specialized method isolating and identifying male-specific genetic markers. Analysts extracted a fragmented genetic signature from an allegedly assaulted victim, yielding findings that absolutely stunned the entire investigative team. That biological fingerprint definitively excluded every single incarcerated individual. The irrefutable data cleared all 4 accused boys. Despite a coerced interrogation where one youth admitted to sexual violence, the microscopic physical evidence violently contradicted his narrative. Scientific proof confirmed his absolute physical absence. A decade of meticulously crafted police theories and agonizing jury verdicts dissolved under one microscopic anomaly. Every indictment was officially dismissed. Both men finally stepped out of confinement following a 10-year ordeal, yet they fundamentally lacked full legal vindication. Prosecutors preserved their option to refile charges. Though physically liberated, the grim taint of a quadruple homicide clung tightly to their reputations. Resetting to zero, the investigation's sole surviving thread was an anonymous genetic sequence preserved in a sterile laboratory tube. Yet microscopic evidence waits silently. Eventually, modern forensic science would evolve enough to decode its dark secrets. Lacking in identity or physical features, this anonymous biological fragment returned 0 national registry hits. It remained a lingering phantom extracted from the carnage. Still, it was undeniably tangible, left behind by a shadowy predator haunting the establishment on the precise evening of the massacre. If the boys were genetically excluded, what unseen monster left that physical trace? Legal counsel Amber Farrelly obsessively pursued this exact anomaly, meticulously dissecting every single observational report filed during that winter night. A pair of unidentified shadows continually surfaced throughout the old witness testimonies. Several bystanders recalled observing a duo lingering inside the parlor shortly before closing time, both cloaked in military-style outerwear. Slumped intimately over a corner booth, the pair engaged in deeply hushed, secretive exchanges that unsettled surrounding onlookers. Patrons present that evening remembered how the two strangers intensely monitored their own chilling reflections staring back from the storefront window pane. As the teenage employees initiated their final closing routine, those lingering figures remained seated before evaporating into the night. Neither phantom voluntarily approached the authorities, keeping their identities entirely obscured. However, one specific bystander provided a strikingly precise visual account. Local private security entrepreneur Durrell Croft held the crucial missing piece. Grabbing a late-night snack around 10 o'clock on the evening of the massacre, he queued up. Suddenly, An unknown figure closed the distance with a highly unnerving inquiry. The stranger probed if he was undercover law enforcement. Upon a negative reply, the suspect approached the register, requesting just one solitary soda. He subsequently bypassed the employee barrier, circumvented the dessert dispensers, and slipped directly through the entryway leading toward the restricted rear quarters. Moving deep into the inventory space, the customer vanished permanently, instantly alarming the trained observer. Questioning the teenager about allowing a random civilian into a secure zone, she innocently replied the patron had merely requested bathroom access. The scenario triggered zero internal alarms. As a naive 17-year-old employee, she simply accommodated a standard customer request. To her, a bathroom visit held absolutely no menace. Conversely, the trained professional experienced a visceral dread, honed by decades of threat assessment. Sensing undeniable malice radiating from the stranger, he refused to leave. Anchoring himself in a booth for 20 minutes, he silently monitored the staff's safety. Hauntingly, the olive-clad individual never emerged from the darkened hallway. Official statements documented the suspect, a clean-shaven Caucasian male, roughly 6 feet, sporting dark hair, a sharp profile, and a resonant voice, nearing 30. He reviewed countless physical arrays and photographic spreads of every single incarcerated youth over the subsequent decades. Every adolescent suspect was firmly rejected. The phantom, he observed, was undeniably an adult, composed, calculating, and chillingly purposeful. A predatory figure capable of politely requesting bathroom access from a teenage worker before dissolving into the shadows, waiting for 4 young girls to be utterly isolated. This chilling behavioral profile languished inside archival boxes for decades, gathering dust while patiently awaiting a matching identity. A massive breakthrough materialized in 2017 when local detectives queried a commercial genetic repository, finally triggering a match. That fragmented evidence from the gruesome crime scene aligned perfectly with biological data already uploaded to the public network. After a quarter-century of absolute dead ends, investigators finally linked the phantom sequence to a tangible human lineage, yet the definitive identity remained hidden. The Bureau had quietly entered the corresponding genetic sequence into the system anonymously. It traced back directly to an inmate confined within the federal penal system. Shielded by strict national privacy statutes, the agency flatly refused to unmask the individual. Detectives in Austin demanded answers, refusing to back down. Yet, federal agents remained immovable. A massive barricade of bureaucratic protocols now stood between the grieving relatives and any hope of closure. Desperate local authorities sought out United States Representative Michael McCall. The politician relentlessly pressured the agency for years, engaging in an endless cycle of formal demands. Ultimately, by 2020, federal agents relented and permitted advanced analysis. The initial biological trace harvested from the slaughter merely contained 16 identifiable points. 16 points is an incredibly frail connection, potentially mirroring countless individuals. Modern diagnostics yielded 25 distinct identifiers. Yet the entire investigation instantly crumbled again. Several newly discovered genetic traits fundamentally contradicted the suspect. The agency issued formal documentation confirming the devastating reality. Their male subject was definitively cleared. The monumental revelation that promised to completely crack the investigation wide open had merely mutated into another dark cul-de-sac. Sonora Thomas was barely 13 when her older sibling was violently snatched away. For decades, she endured crippling anxiety episodes and mysterious physical agony defying medical logic. Extensive psychological counseling eventually revealed the grim truth. Her chronic suffering was intrinsically tethered to the trauma of the unsolved butchery. Channeling that profound agony, she forged a new path. She transformed into a clinical counselor, guiding victims burdened by the exact unseen psychological scars she harbored since adolescence. On her wedding day, she purposefully reserved a vacant seat adorned with a solitary blossom during the vows. That poignant memorial marked exactly where her older sibling belonged. Then, during 2015, tragedy struck again when Sonora lost her mother. Maria Thomas had previously fled the city entirely to escape the agonizing daily triggers. She had endured grueling hours inside the cold courthouse. The grieving mother witnessed guilty verdicts, delivered and subsequently overturned, ultimately taking her final breath without ever discovering the true monster who butchered Eliza. An enduring, agonizing psychological torment lingers in the shadow of a cold case. The bleeding never stops. It operates as an omnipresent ghost. Detective Jones had officially stepped down and relocated far beyond Texas borders, yet his departure offered zero tranquility. 3 decades later, sleeplessness continued hunting him. The horrifying visuals from that macabre crime scene crushed him daily, while the unkept oath he had sworn to the grieving relatives cast a permanent, suffocating shadow. However, during 2022, an investigator named Dan Jackson inherited the monstrous dossier. He operated with surgical precision and chilling patience. Diverging from the flawed tactics of his predecessors, this detective refused to force the evidence into a preconceived, biased hypothesis. He painstakingly dissected every single admission of guilt, re-examined civilian testimonies, and scrutinized thousands of complex scientific autopsies. Glaring contradictions buried within interrogations suddenly surfaced flaws prior officers actively suppressed or simply missed. He hunted verifiable facts, entirely abandoning the comfort of a convenient storyline. Crucially, this modern investigator wielded an unprecedented arsenal: unrestricted entry into massive digital intelligence networks and cutting-edge genetic sequencing capabilities. Such forensic wizardry was purely science fiction back in '91, completely unavailable in 2001, and still emerging during 2017. His crosshairs locked onto a seemingly insignificant artifact, a tiny remnant harvested from the slaughterhouse floor, logged, and buried deep inside a dusty evidence vault for over 3 decades. A solitary .380 caliber bullet cartridge extracted from a grimy drain inside the establishment. It had rested there quietly in the dark, patiently anticipating a mind sharp enough to interrogate it. The investigator uploaded the physical parameters of that ejected brass into the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. This sprawling digital registry acts as a forensic web, connecting lethal weaponry and discharged ammunition to violent atrocities stretching coast to coast. That very afternoon, his telephone shattered the silence. A definitive match materialized, a chillingly similar cold case homicide from 1998 located in Kentucky. The exact same .380 caliber pistol discharged during the Austin massacre had seemingly resurfaced a full 7 years down the timeline. It struck hundreds of miles distant, completely shattering jurisdictional boundaries. The phantom firearm migrated across borders, wielded by a predator mirroring its transient, untraceable nature. The dedicated investigator immediately boarded a flight to Kentucky, flanked by veteran homicide specialists and a high-ranking delegate dispatched from the Attorney General. As they convened with local law enforcement, aligning the grisly details of both horrors, the mirror image of the atrocities felt intensely unnerving. The calculated methodology, the explosive brutality, the grotesque staging of the corpses, and the unimaginable psychological torture inflicted prior to their executions all perfectly aligned. Random chance could not excuse this symmetry. A sinister blueprint had emerged, pointing directly to a singular monster. Yet, the relentless detective pushed even further. He executed a maneuver entirely unprecedented in modern policing. The investigator manually reached out to absolutely every forensic facility nationwide equipped for advanced y-str genetic sequencing. He systematically contacted every single institution, presenting an identical, highly specific inquiry to each set of scientists. He challenged them to physically scour their archives for a correlation to the unidentified male extracted from the Texas massacre. It was a monumental gamble, a blind plunge into total darkness. He was essentially demanding that scientists nationwide visually audit their massive ledgers to spot a ghost from a 30-year-old Lone Star State bloodbath. Most reported absolute silence, save for a single beacon. The South Carolina State Laboratory confirmed the impossible. 27 of 27 markers perfectly aligned, yielding a complete genetic fingerprint. Every microscopic allele mirrored the killer flawlessly. This was no statistical fraction or educated guess. It was an absolute, undisputed lock that completely eradicated any lingering skepticism. The facility required a grueling 14-day window to authenticate the anomaly. Throughout the institution's history, such an unorthodox directive had never been received. The scientists demanded bulletproof procedures capable of withstanding vicious judicial scrutiny. For the investigator, those 14 days became the most agonizingly suspenseful stretch of his career. He was certain he had finally snared a monster. The agonizing caveat was that the predator's identity remained heavily guarded. The final curtain had not yet risen. On August 22nd, the facility delivered the phantom's identity, Robert Eugene Brashers, conclusively linked to a 1990 sexual assault and homicide in Greenville, South Carolina. Jackson instantly dialed local authorities. The investigator on the line was completely blind to the gruesome events at that frozen yogurt parlor. Yet, before Jackson could even set the scene, the voice cut him off with a chilling inquiry. Were the targets restrained using their own garments? A cold shiver cascaded down Jackson's spine. This was the dark hallmark, the invisible thread pulling the entire nightmare together. Enter Robert Eugene Brashers, a man found guilty of battering and firing upon a Florida resident back in 1985. He spent a mere 3.5 years behind bars before walking free in 1989. The justice system unleashed him, and he instantly returned to his grim compulsions. By 1990, he breached a private residence in Greenville, South Carolina. There, he violently overpowered the resident, battered her, and choked out her final breaths. 1991 brought the frozen yogurt parlor massacre. Then, in 1997, he infiltrated a residence outside Memphis, Tennessee, where he brutally attacked a vulnerable 14-year-old girl. In 1998, his shadow fell upon a quiet Missouri residence. Inside, Sherry Scherer and her 12-year-old daughter, Megan, were completely oblivious to the approaching monster. He ruthlessly bound them before extinguishing both of their lives. Mere hours later, he violently breached another residence down in Dyersburg, Tennessee, discharging a weapon at a defenseless woman. Against all odds, she survived the brutal attack. Months later, Arkansas police finally apprehended him while he attempted to violently infiltrate yet another vulnerable woman's sanctuary. During a tense January 1999 motel standoff with police, Brashers opted for the coward's exit and turned a 380 on himself. Just 8 months prior, 4 blameless young men were locked away for his gruesome handiwork. He took his final breath fully aware that innocent souls bore the weight of his sins. Yet, a chilling footnote remained. One crucial puzzle piece had sat quietly entombed within dusty case archives for more than 3 decades. Barely 48 hours after the horrific yogurt shop massacre, Border Patrol agents halted Brashers at a checkpoint between El Paso and Las Cruces, almost 600 miles from Austin. He was piloting a vehicle recently flagged as stolen out of Georgia. Hidden inside that car, investigators uncovered a .380 pistol. It was the exact make and caliber used to extinguish the lives of 4 innocent teenage girls. Authorities simply booked him for vehicular theft and unlawfully possessing a firearm as a convicted felon. The weapon ended up returning to his father. Just 48 hours. The ultimate answer was hiding right there from the very beginning, resting in a stolen ride 600 miles down the highway, yet it slipped right through their fingers. This was a phantom who had previously staged his own demise. He planted a fabricated obituary, utilized aliases, and evaporated for weeks. Even his own daughter characterized him as a phantom, leading a sinister double life. An apex predator concealed in broad daylight. His genetic markers were recovered from 3 victims, while ballistic forensics definitively connected his firearm across state borders. A .380 secured from his vehicle mere days post-slaughter. Furthermore, the very pistol he used for his suicide flawlessly matched the weathered casing that waited 34 agonizing years in a storm drain to speak. Then arrived September 29, 2025. Austin's mayor approached the podium, delivering the profound resolution that a haunted community had desperately craved for over 30 agonizing years. The police chief took the stage, finally uttering the phantom's name, Robert Eugene Brashers. Every solitary piece of physical evidence salvaged from the horrific scene pointed directly to his ghost. The file was officially designated as exceptionally cleared. They had absolute proof of his guilt, but the killer had been dead since 1999. He would never face handcuffs, a jury, or the cold stare of a courtroom, just the unvarnished truth. For shattered families enduring a 34-year nightmare, that closure was finally enough. A grieving relative approached the microphone. Her voice trembled with sorrow, yet her delivery remained fiercely resolute. The raw truth was their only objective. They never desired to see innocent men caged for a demon's handiwork. For them, this agonizing journey was never about blind vengeance. That grim reality always lingered. He reflected on the dedicated investigators who anchored themselves to grieving relatives across 30 agonizing years. These detectives simply refused to surrender or become desensitized. The general public rarely comprehends the quiet, grueling toll of their unseen, relentless pursuit. Amy's father, Bob Ayers, quietly approached Detective Jackson. Pressing a tiny emblem into the investigator's palm, he conveyed a profound, hauntingly brief promise. "We will never forget. The murderer's child, Deborah, was barely 8 when her father committed suicide." The horrific reality of his true identity remained completely concealed from her until 2018. Discovering the grim reality of the yogurt shop massacre, she wept, issuing a tearful apology for the catastrophic psychological trauma her father inflicted. Wishing he had survived to face earthly retribution, she chillingly branded her own blood a vicious predator concealed behind a flawless disguise. Scott and Springsteen eventually achieved total public exoneration, but only after surrendering almost a decade behind concrete walls for unspeakable atrocities they absolutely did not commit. Scott languished on death row, awaiting a lethal injection for a butchery orchestrated by a phantom, a perpetrator who was already in his grave before the gavel ever fell. Defense attorneys demanded $80,000 per stolen year. Yet no financial settlement could ever resurrect the precious time this system brutally extracted. Money cannot resurrect stolen youth, nor can hollow apologies erase the psychological terror inflicted inside those claustrophobic interrogation rooms. Revealing the terrifying extent of his psychological fracturing, Scott later confessed, "For a fleeting period, I genuinely convinced myself I was somehow complicit in this horrific slaughter." The state stripped away more than his physical liberty. Investigators systematically dismantled his psyche, manipulating his fragile mind until he fully internalized guilt for an atrocity he never committed. This represents a total absence of justice. It transcends mere failure, becoming something fundamentally sinister. Bereft of her sister at 13, Sonora unraveled into a dark spiral of narcotics, liquor, psychiatric wards, and restrictive reformatories. She painstakingly reconstructed her fractured identity, emerging as a therapist to guide others through the exact psychological agony she knew intimately. At her own wedding, a vacant seat stood as a silent, heartbreaking monument to Eliza. Tragically, their mother, Maria, passed away before ever witnessing this bittersweet milestone. Death claimed her in 2015, forever denying her the identity of her daughter's murderer. Then came John Jones, the initial lead investigator. He was the individual who stepped into that blood-soaked yogurt shop on December 6, 1991, shadowed closely by a rolling camera crew. 34 grueling years of sleepless nights, 3 decades of carrying those gruesome mental photographs. And then, the distinctive green and white shirt, worn solely on the night of the slayings. He swore a solemn oath to the grieving relatives. That garment would remain untouched until the perpetrator was captured. For 34 agonizing years, it lingered in the pitch black of a closet. It waited in silence, much like the shattered families and the dormant clues. Finally, at long last, John Jones could pull it from its resting place. A 13-year-old child who desperately dragged herself toward an escape route only to perish. A shattered matriarch, stripped of both her girls within those exact same walls. A surviving sibling who permanently silenced her sister's name because the sheer agony cut entirely too deep. A grieving patriarch permanently robbed of watching his child blossom. An investigator who shelved a garment for 34 agonizing years. And a solitary bullet casing lodged inside a drain waiting equally long to speak. Absolute justice demanded 34 grueling years to surface from the shadows, yet ultimately, it made itself known. As we examine this darkness, a chilling question remains. Do the falsely condemned individuals warrant financial retribution for the decades stolen from their lives? Had these advanced forensic capabilities been available back in 1991, exactly how many innocent souls might have been spared? We speak not just of the initial victims, but every subsequent target Brashers terrorized following that bloodbath. Unraveling this horrific puzzle consumed 34 entire years. What other chilling cold case sits just a single genetic breakthrough away from its final resolution? Share your theories in the discussion below.